Welcome back. Today is an introduction to shading on toned paper with charcoal. In the olden days, that was considered to be much easier than shading on white paper because most of what we see in the world averages out to a value of gray, middle gray. And there's very little in the world is pure white or pure black. So if you start on gray paper, you just have a lot less work to do than if you start on white paper or black paper. We are used to shading on white paper, and we're used to thinking that that's sort of... So, shading on gray paper. We're going to start by doing a simple value scale. The basic idea here is that our middle value is the gray of the paper, and so we're never going to touch the paper where we need our middle value. So near the top of your paper, make a long rectangle proportion about like this. We're aiming for about 9 times wider than it is tall. Make a square in the middle. Divide this side in half. Divide this side in half. And then divide these 4 sections in half again, and you'll end up with 9 boxes going across. So let's put a little X over your middle square. And that's going to remind you not to touch it because we're only going to leave that for our middle gray. And then we're going to use the hardest charcoal pencil you have, which should be the HB pencil. It also says hard on it. And we're going to shade with a first shading direction. Remember, I'm left-handed, so I'm shading this way. You're going to shade right-handed, the other way if you're right-handed. We're going to shade these 4 boxes as lightly as we can. If you're right-handed, you shade the opposite direction. You shade like this. And what I'm hoping you're going to find is that you're going to notice right away this is a lot easier than doing it on white paper. It's a lot easier to organize your thoughts correctly. And we're going to go ahead and do the same thing with white on these 4 boxes. And that's the first step in any charcoal study is dividing the light from the darkness, where you are making a decision that these areas are in shadow and these areas are in light, and the transitional areas are the gray of the paper. Then we're going to stick with the HB hard pencil, and we're going to do vertical shading on these 3 boxes. You'll notice this paper is a little streaky. That's because it's hand toned, which means I just take a gray acrylic house paint, interior paint, don't use exterior, and thin it with plenty of water until it's about the consistency of half and half, and then brush it thinly over the whole sheet. If you don't see streaks, you know that you need to add some more water to your paint. You shouldn't use a thick coating of paint to tone paper. Also, you never want to use anything except for flat paint. If you use gloss, semi-gloss, or even eggshell, it's not going to work as well. Because what we have created here is a kind of a texture to the surface that you only get from flat paint. So I just did, with vertical shading, white on these 3 boxes. And we should be starting to see even steps across these 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I guess we'll go to horizontal shading. Let me define the edge of this box again a little more clearly so I can see where it is. And then I'm going to shade just with a little bit firmer pressure horizontally across these 2. And a little bit firmer pressure horizontally across these 2. And as you've already figured out, the last step is going to be to shade the final box. I'm going to go back to a vertical direction, and I'm letting myself press a little bit harder here because we want this to be almost black. And this one to be almost white. So now you can make sure you have even steps. I'm noticing this bottom of this one's a little too pale. You can go back and retouch your squares a little bit if you need to. The goal here is to have 9 even steps. And I'm going to say that's good enough for me. Right under this, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to catch up, but we're going to make a skinnier bar. And we're going to practice making a gradated value scale. We've done this before with graphite on white paper, but I'm trying to create a smooth transition from almost pure white at this end to almost pure black on this end. And I'm trying to match the values of the squares along this bar. So and notice you're going to discover very quickly you can only get this effect by shading always in towards your halftone. Your halftone is that square in the middle. And the way I want you to think of this is it's exactly like 2 sets of fingers that are kind of reaching towards each other like this, but not interlacing. Okay, when we're trying to make an even gradation of tone, we don't want the black and the white to mix together. And I'll just show you up here when you do allow them to mix, you don't have to do this. When you mix the black and the white, what you actually create is a different hue of gray. And it just really, it stands out like a sore thumb. Can everyone see that? Because it's like a kind of more of a bluish gray, and the paper's more of a warm gray. And if I smudge it, it would look even worse. So we never want to let the black and the white mix together. Very important. The other reason that's important is because one of the marks of a very successful drawing is that the artist made it look a lot easier than it probably was. And look at how graceful it is to show this even transition from black to white with so little effort. Like I barely had to touch the paper, and yet I have a nice even gradation of tone. If you start blending your black and the white in the middle, the effect is not only uglier, but it makes it look like you had to try really hard to do that. And we don't want anyone to think we tried hard. That's aesthetically unpleasant. It's kind of like if you go to watch a professional dance and you see the ballerina like standing there like huffing and puffing. You don't want to see that, right? It's supposed to look easy and graceful. That's part of what beauty is, right? So it's an important thing to understand. A lot of us just want the world to know how hard we tried and how hard we worked, but in artistry, that's never the point. Okay, so you probably need a minute to catch up, so I'll be right back. Okay, now we're going to draw the ball. Do your best to draw a circle. Use very light pressure with the graphite. You'll notice that the graphite comes off your pencil a little more easily onto this paper than it does onto untreated paper. Again, because of the texture of the paper. You'll also notice that this paper takes erasures a lot better than regular paper. Like if you erase something, it's going to come off very cleanly. You're not even going to see, and it's not going to, because it's not going to leave that texture of erased paper because the fibers are protected by the layer of paint. And some people really, really like that. So I'm going to do the typical annotations on here so you can see. So this is sort of the angle of the form shadow, where the terminator starts and ends. And so this is the angle of the cast shadow, creating the tangents to these 2 points. So this is really close to 45 degrees, I would say. And that gives us something close to 45 degrees for these also, going the other direction. And the angle of our cast shadow is only about between 5 and 10 degrees. And it passes through the ball right here. This is sort of where the ball is touching the ground. So I'm going to mark this point and then draw the axis of the cast shadow sloping up. And then I'm going to draw my ellipse of the cast shadow around that axis. And these are all things we've done a few times. It should be getting a little easier. And remember, this form shadow edge is also an ellipse. We're just seeing the front half of it, but and we could use a little fractional thinking. If we look for where this is in relation to this, it's about 2/3 of the way up. So we go about 2/3 of the way up here. We could say that this distance here is about half of this distance above it. So if we go here to here, this is about 2 times this. And we can also use the clock idea to make sure our cast shadow is locked in the right place. This is about 8:30, so maybe it could be a little higher in my drawing. And this is about 4:30, so that looks about right. And it can be helpful to just drop in our horizon line where the table ends as part of our shadow map. And then we're going to erase these internal construction lines before we do any shading. I know the sphere is simpler than some of the things we practiced drawing recently, but since we're using a new technique, it's always good to sort of dial things back. And spheres are easy, yeah. It's the most basic shaded form.
Okay, nice.
So now I'm going to do first shading, and I'm doing my left-handed shading again. So righties are going the other way, and I'm just throwing a tone over the entire shadow map. Like this. Right-handed slants the other direction. And then what's different about this technique is we're also going to do first shading with white. Just like we did on our value scale. And what we want to do is we can go right up to this line, right up to this edge. And then we have to make up our minds, like where in the photograph is the value of the gray closest to the gray of my paper. And I'm going to say the value of my paper, as you can actually see on the screen, is really close to the value of the wall. And that means the floor is also going to be in light. So I'm going to do first shading of white on the floor. Now we're creating a little study of this form, not a whole composition. So you don't feel like you have to shade all the way to the edge of your paper. What we're going to do instead is called vignetting, where we just shade, we sort of let the shading fade off as it moves away from the object and its shadows, like this. We're just using the shading on the ground and the wall to support the drawing of the form. And I can zoom out a little so you can see what I mean about that. And the final step here is to identify where our shadows are sort of have soft edges and erase the shadow map where those soft edges have to occur. So, and you'll notice on gray paper, when we erase the shadow map, we're also creating a zone of gray between the black and the white. So it sort of has dual purpose. We're getting rid of that dark line. We're also creating a halftone. This is called working subtractively, where we're really influencing the drawing by removing something instead of adding something. And at this stage of the drawing, any errors that you've made in construction are going to become really painfully obvious, because you can look at your drawing and really see it in 3 dimensions. And this is where you want to make corrections. So put your pencils down for just a second. I'm looking at my drawing and I'm feeling like the sphere is a little too fat right here. So what I'm going to do, I want you to see how easy it is to fix things. So I'm going to just experiment with bringing this line in a little, and then I'm going to erase to my new boundary, and then I'm going to throw my first shading of white back in up to that edge. Working on toned paper like this is almost like working on a whiteboard. It's very forgiving. You can erase as many times as you want. And now the form is reading a little more symmetrical to me. So you can make whatever corrections you think you need to make on your drawing, and then we will proceed. So this is the fun part. We're going to start actually doing second shading, and this is where things start to look good. So make sure you have a sharp pencil, and we're going to start by sharpening this edge using curved strokes. We don't want it to look like a big clumsy outline, so I'm using a lot of strokes with very light pressure. But I'm not afraid to go too dark here, because I know that my form shadow is going to get the darkest where it curves up away from the reflected light. So along here, we're going to be going through the core shadow. Remember, our direction switches, so we're going sort of straight up when we get to this point, and then when we get around to here, we're curving the other way. But my pressure has to get lighter and lighter, so that by the time I get down here, I'm sharpening this edge, but using a much lighter stroke than I was using up here. And then we're going to go down towards the reflected light, but using the same direction. I used to start people right off on the gray paper, because it is honestly a lot easier than the white paper. But I realized that it takes a while to get used to curving your strokes the right way, and it's probably makes more sense to just practice that on white paper. Once you feel confident, then you can switch to the gray. Now, our edge sharpening here is all with black on the ball. So I can bring this down a little further, sharpening this contour as it goes down towards the reflected light. But then under here, the edge sharpening is on the ground. It's darker on the ground. So now I'm going to sharpen this edge, but I'm going to be sharpening it by shading darker on the ground. And somewhere in the middle here, your edge should technically sort of disappear, because this is dark against light, this is light against dark. And right in here, there should be a place, see right here, where the edge actually disappears.
Yeah.
And most people have a hard time believing that, so they really do, they work hard to make it look like the edge is visible everywhere, but your drawings will look a lot better if you can just, if it disappears in the motif, let it disappear in your drawing too. There's an idea from Gestalt psychology, yeah, about object completion. So if you, did I show you this drawing already?
You look at it as a triangle.
Yeah, so if you draw this, your brain is going to complete the form and you're going to see like a whole triangle there. Most of you are already familiar with this concept. So your brain literally, like, you create an illusion that you are seeing parts of the triangle that you can't actually see. Does everyone get that? Like, you're seeing this outline even though it's not there. Your brain does the same thing on the photograph of the sphere. Your brain like completes that contour even though the contour disappears for a little bit. And what you want to do in your drawing is don't listen to your brain. Your brain's going to tell you, oh, I need to somehow outline this whole thing, but you don't have to. Okay, on the ground now we're going to switch to horizontal shading, like this. And we're going to go lighter and lighter as we go up. And what you should be noticing is that you've already, because you're working on the gray paper, you've already produced like quite a lot of illusion in your drawing without really working on it very much. Like this is really fast. And I'm not going to try to achieve my final values yet or my final edge sharpness. What I want to do is, we're going to call this second shading, and our final touches are going to happen after we've done second shading also with white. So we're going to go just a little brighter on the floor with horizontal again. We want to always use horizontal on the floor because otherwise our cast shadow is going to look like a half a banana or something. We want it to look like it's part of the floor, and the easiest way to do that is with this consistent shading direction. And we're going to shade away from the ball here. I haven't used any sharpening strokes yet. We're going to do that in a minute. And away from the ball up here. And now, this is something we haven't done before. We're going to use contour shading in the light to sharpen this edge a little. Don't make it too bright right along the edge. That's a typical beginner's mistake. It looks really bright here because it's against that darker background and because the edge is sharp, but it's actually going to be a little brighter right through here in the center light. So this is where we can press a little harder, but not all the way to the edge. And then for our transition, we're going to be shading down towards the core shadow. And again, this again is the idea. These fingers are reaching from two directions towards each other, but they are not overlapping or intersecting. So one of the great intellectuals of the Renaissance was a guy named Vasari, and he wrote The Lives of the Artists, and he commented once that some of the greatest artists of the time were capable of doing drawings on white paper, which was considered a remarkable feat because it's so much difficult to do a shaded drawing on white paper than on gray paper. And yet many artists just draw their whole lives only on white paper and never experience this. So our center light is up here. As you may remember, the highlight isn't always in the middle of the center light. Our highlight is sort of a little lower because the highlight is that reflection of the light source. And it has to do more with our position in relation to the ball and the light source. But it's very satisfying to put that in. I'm seeing another little bump on my form. So again, it's very easy to erase and make corrections. And if you feel like you went a little too hard somewhere, you can use your kneaded eraser and lift some of the shading off without completely erasing it. I'm going to do a little bit, so watch carefully right here, because this is tricky. What I'm going to try to do is sharpen some of my edges. You see how sharp this edge needs to be? And my drawing doesn't really look sharp enough. So I'm going to, but the goal here is to sharpen it without making it look outlined. So I'm going to do a few sharpening strokes right along that edge. And then I'm going to immediately revert back to my horizontal strokes and sort of integrate that sharpened area with the rest of the background. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. You'll notice that right under here, the background abuts the blackish gray of the sphere. and creates a very crisp edge, which, just like the other side, disappears right about here. So right about here, the values on both sides are about the same, so we don't want to sharpen that. And again, we want to integrate that by pulling across with more horizontal strokes. Like that. And I'm also gonna sharpen this edge just a little bit, not with sharpening strokes though, because it's this edge of the cast shadow is definitely out of focus. You see what I'm talking about, this right here? So what I do, how I handle that is I just go as tightly as I can, but using horizontal strokes instead of sharpening strokes. So it's coming just a little more into focus without becoming really crisp like a cutout. And the same back here. This edge looks too sloppy in my drawing, so I'm going to just go a little harder. And I'm going to carry my black right so it's almost touching the white. Basically, when you have a wide area of gray like here, you create a very soft edge. When you have a very narrow area of gray like here, you create a semi-soft edge. And where there's no gray at all showing like here, you create a very sharp edge. And if you can just learn to control at least to those 3 levels of sharpness, you'll be on your way to creating great shaded studies. So I've done my second shading everywhere now, and what I'm going to do is get a little bit back from my drawing virtually and compare and try to improve my final effect. So I can see now that my brain's looking at this and saying, yeah, this is really 3-dimensional. Like, I could pick this up off the table kind of believability. I can also see that the form isn't perfect and that this contour of my white needs to come a little higher across the top. And you'll notice I erased the black outline first because you never want to shade white over black. And it's better not to have any black lines showing along this edge anyway, because this edge is basically light on light, and so you really shouldn't have any black outline showing. Okay. Went a little too bright right here. So if you're frustrated with your drawing, remember this paper, you can erase all day long on this paper, so just try to make it a little better. And some of you have pencils that are other hardnesses. For example, 6B is the hardest. This is a 2B pencil. It's a medium pencil. And I'm going to use this medium pencil to get my darkest darks, just to bump them up one step darker. The softer a pencil is, the darker mark it's going to make. Yeah, so the harder pencil, because the softer it is, the more it's going to leave behind, right? When you're drawing, you're just leaving part of the pencil behind on the paper. So yeah, like if you remember, charcoal pencils are carbon. Diamonds are also carbon. Like obviously if you dragged a diamond across a piece of paper, it wouldn't leave a mark. I mean, it would scratch it, but none of the diamond would come off onto the paper, right? So the harder something is, the less it's going to leave of itself behind. And I'm going to use this softer pencil to go just a little bit darker in my core shadow. You don't have to use a softer pencil. You can really, with this paper, you can get away with just the HB pencil, but if you want to see what that's like, feel free to try it out. It is generally good practice to, when you need it to be darker, it's good practice to find a softer pencil rather than the alternative, which is just pressing really hard. Partly because it's a bad habit to press really hard with your pencil, and partly because pressing hard, it kind of burnishes or polishes the paper. And as soon as the paper gets smooth and shiny, you stop seeing your darkest darks. So now that I've darkened a little more through my core shadow, remember that thing we've talked about where the reflected light suddenly really looks way too bright. Can everyone see that in my drawing? It's like, and it just goes to show that values are all about relationships. Like that reflected light didn't look too bright a minute ago, but now that I've darkened a little bit above and below it, it looks way too bright. So in order to control my shading, I'm going to go back to my hard pencil and back to my first shading direction and just unify that area. Just pull that back so that the shadow doesn't pop so much. And I'm going to stay with my HB pencil and just create a little more solidity inside this shadow shape so it doesn't look so patchy. And also going to just unify. I'm going to go back to first shading direction and just unify some of my lights as well. Whenever an area looks splotchy, you can always just go back to your first shading direction and even it out. And now, see how this I didn't touch this with black at all. This is just the gray of the paper here. But that edge is standing out too much. And so I'm going to go back to first shading direction and just flatten this out a little bit and push it back. And again, your drawing will look better if you selectively bring out your edges and don't try to bring them out everywhere. Now, what if I wanted to include that little, see that little dent in the ball right there? What I'd want to do is erase the white. You never want to put black on top of white. So I'm going to erase that little shadow. I also don't want this to stand out too much, so I'm going to use a few little hatched lines to indicate that shape. Just like shading any shadow, I'm not, see what I'm doing? Sort of like hatching that shape in. And I'm going to hatch in that little highlight underneath. And that's how you can add texture to the drawing. It's much simpler than it looks. And sometimes you'll add something like that and you'll think that's a little too distracting. You can just touch it once with your knead eraser and it becomes a little subtler and more integrated into the surface. And for the final step, I'm going to say I still have too strong of a reflected light here. So I'm going to do a little more contour shading to bring this core shadow down a little more. And a little more first shading to just create less of a value difference here. And I think that's about right. When your eye sees a very sharp edge, or I'm sorry, when you see high contrast, your eye's going to tell you it's seeing a sharp edge, and when you see low contrast, your brain's going to tell you you're seeing a soft edge. So what you have to do is when you have to force yourself to sharpen edges like this one, which are very low contrast, and make them really sharp even though the value difference along the edge is pretty small. And there's also going to be times when you need to force yourself to make a soft edge even though the value difference is large and you think you're seeing something that's sharper than it is. Okay, thanks for watching at home. See you next time.